Cole had seen a lot of broken places in his life. Burned buildings, empty streets, skies that used to be full of ships and were now full of smoke. He had walked through enough ruins to stop flinching at the sound of crumbling stone or the smell of ash in the air. That was just the job. You showed up. You looked for survivors. You did what you could with what you had. The neutral zone between the human colony and the Dracovian border had been quiet for 3 days since the ceasefire. Quiet in the way that made experienced people nervous. Not peaceful quiet. Just the kind of quiet that came after something terrible and before something worse. The ground was still warm in places from fires that had burned themselves out. Walls that looked solid would shift and groan if you stepped too close. Every few hours something somewhere would collapse on its own, just because the damage had finally caught up with the structure holding it together. Most of the other relief workers had pulled back to the outer edge of the zone. The official word was that the area was too unstable for search operations. The unofficial word was that nothing alive was left in there anyway. Cole had heard both. He had nodded politely at both. Then he had picked up his kit and walked back in alone. He was not trying to be a hero. He was not trying to prove anything. He just could not make himself believe the zone was empty until he had checked it himself. That was a habit he had carried since his field medic days. You checked. You always checked. Because the one time you did not was the one time it mattered. The street he was moving through had been some kind of market once. He could tell by the shape of the stalls, the way the debris was arranged, the scraps of colored fabric half buried under stone. Now it was just rubble and silence and the low gray light of a sky that could not decide if it wanted to rain. He was about to turn back when he heard it. It was small. Barely a sound at all. More like the idea of a sound than an actual one. A thin, high noise that cut through the silence for just a second and then stopped. Cole went still. He held his breath. He waited. It came again. He moved toward it carefully, watching where he put his feet, testing each step before he gave it his full weight. The sound was coming from a collapsed section of wall near what used to be the far end of the market. A large beam had fallen across a pile of stone and created a small hollow underneath. Cole crouched down and looked into the dark space beneath the beam. 2 eyes looked back at him. They were gold, bright and sharp and full of fear. The face around them was small and covered in dark green scales, and the creature pressed against the back of the hollow was shaking. One of its wings was bent at a wrong angle. There was a dark stain spreading slowly across the stone beneath it. Cole had never been this close to a Dracovian child before. He had seen adults from a distance. Tall, powerful, ancient-looking, even the younger ones. This one was nothing like that. This one was just a small, scared, hurt thing trying to make itself as small as possible in a dark corner. Cole did not think about the politics. He did not think about the warnings his colleagues had given him about staying out of Dracovian affairs. He did not think about the fact that Dracovian territory technically began at the wall behind him, or that approaching one of their children without permission was considered deeply offensive by their culture. He thought about the wing. He thought about the blood. He thought about how long the child had probably been in there alone. He set his kit down slowly so the sound would not startle the child and sat back on his heels. "Hey," he said quietly. "I am not going to hurt you." The gold eyes did not blink. The shaking did not stop. But the child did not try to move away either, which Cole decided to count as progress. He started talking. Quietly, steadily, the way he used to talk to frightened patients in the field when there was nothing else to offer them but the sound of a calm voice. He talked about nothing important. He described what he was going to do before he did it. He told the child he was going to reach in slowly and that the child could make noise if it wanted to. He told the child the wing looked bad but not unfixable. He did not know if any of that was true. He just kept his voice even and his movements slow. It took a long time before the child stopped shaking enough for Cole to get close. When he finally reached in and got his hands on the beam that had pinned the child's lower body against the stone, he could feel how wrong the weight distribution was. The beam was not the only thing holding the structure up. Moving it wrong would bring more of the wall down. He worked carefully. His hands were steady even when his arms were not. He had done this kind of thing before, extracting people from collapsed structures, figuring out what to move and in what order, working with what was available. He did not have the right tools for this. He used what he had. The child watched him the entire time with those gold eyes. At some point the shaking slowed. At some point the small clawed hand closest to Cole stopped pressing against the stone and just rested there. Cole noticed. He did not say anything about it. When the beam finally shifted enough, he reached in with both arms and pulled the child out carefully, keeping the broken wing supported as best he could. The child was heavier than he expected and made a sharp pain sound when the wing moved. Cole held on. He had just straightened up with the child in his arms when he heard it. The low, deep groan of stone that meant something above had been waiting for exactly the shift he had just made. He did not look up. There was no point in looking up. He turned his body so the child was facing away from the wall and tucked the small head against his shoulder and made himself as much of a barrier as he could between the child and what was coming. The wall came down. The pain was enormous and immediate, and then it was nothing at all. He was aware for a moment of the ground and then of the child scrambling away from him and then of the gold eyes again, wide and unblinking, staring at him from a few feet away where the child had landed clear of the collapse. The broken wing dragged on the ground. The child did not run. It just stood there looking at him. Cole tried to say something. He was not sure what came out. His vision was already narrowing at the edges, the way it did when the body was making decisions the mind had not caught up with yet. He could see the gold eyes. He focused on those. Then he could not see anything. He did not hear the heavy footsteps that came from the eastern edge of the zone 20 seconds later. He did not see the 4 Dracovian soldiers who emerged from the shadows where they had been watching the entire scene from a distance. The distance they had maintained because the zone was technically neutral ground and because their orders had been clear. He did not see the way the lead soldier stopped when he saw the child standing over the fallen human. He did not see the way that soldier looked at the child and then at Cole and then said something quietly to the others that made all of them go very still. He did not see them move Cole carefully out of the rubble. He did not see the child refuse to leave Cole's side until one of the soldiers gently guided it away. He did not hear the transmission the lead soldier sent back to the kingdom, a short and careful message, delivered in a voice that had lost some of its steadiness somewhere between the beginning of the sentence and the end. Cole was not aware of any of it. The neutral zone was quiet again. The smoke moved slowly across the gray sky. Somewhere behind the mountains that marked the beginning of Dracovian territory, something very old and very important had just been set into motion by a human relief worker who had simply refused to walk past a sound in the dark. He had not survived. But he had not been left behind either. The soldiers carried him toward the mountains as the first rain began to fall. The first thing Cole noticed was the ceiling. It was high. Much higher than any ceiling had a right to be. The stone above him was dark and smooth and carved with patterns that moved in the low light like something alive. Shapes that looked like wings. Shapes that looked like fire. Shapes that looked like something in between the two that Cole did not have a word for. The light in the room came from long strips of amber stone built into the walls, glowing softly and steadily without any flame that he could see. He lay still for a moment and just looked at the ceiling. Then the rest of his body reported in. He was not in pain. That was the first strange thing. The last thing he remembered was the wall coming down and the kind of impact that should have left him broken in ways that did not come back from. But there was no pain. There was a deep heaviness in his limbs, the kind that came after serious illness or long unconsciousness, but nothing sharp. Nothing wrong in the way he had expected wrong to feel. He turned his head slowly and looked at the room around him. Everything was large. The bed he was lying on was a flat stone platform covered in something dark and soft that he could not identify. It was wide enough that he could have lain sideways across it 3 times over. The ceiling was at least 40 feet up. The doorway at the far end of the room was built for something that stood twice his height and probably twice his width as well. A single window high on the wall let in light that was pale and cool, the kind of light that came in the early morning before the sun had fully committed to the day. Cole sat up slowly. His head swam for a moment and then settled. He looked down at his hands. They were clean. The cuts and scrapes from the ruins were gone. The deep bruising he had felt across his back and shoulders when he was working the beam was simply not there anymore. His skin looked normal. Better than normal. Like something had gone carefully over every inch of him and repaired what was damaged. He was wearing clothing that was not his. Simple and dark and clearly made for a human body, which meant someone had thought about him specifically when they chose it. That detail sat in the back of his mind quietly. He was still processing the room when the door opened. The Dracovian who entered was old. Cole could tell that immediately even though he had very little experience reading Dracovian faces. It was something about the way this one moved, not slow, not weak, but carrying weight that had nothing to do with the body. The scales were deep gray with edges that caught the amber light and turned it gold. The eyes were the color of cooling embers, dark orange fading to brown at the edges. The frame was enormous in the way all adult Dracovians were enormous, filling the doorway completely as the figure stepped through. The robes were dark and simple. No decoration that Cole could immediately identify. But every guard who had been standing outside the door, and Cole had counted 4 of them through the gap before it closed, had gone completely still when this one approached. The kind of still that was not trained. The kind that was instinct. Cole did not know much about Dracovian culture. But he knew enough to understand that the being walking toward him was not a healer or a soldier or a diplomat. He started to get up. Some instinct about standing when authority entered a room. The Dracovian stopped. Then, slowly and with great deliberateness, it lowered itself onto one knee. Cole stopped moving entirely. The room was very quiet. The kneeling took a moment because the Dracovian was large and the gesture was clearly not one the body made often. But it was done fully and without hesitation. One knee on the stone floor. The great head lowered slightly. The ember eyes looking at Cole with an expression he could not read but could feel the weight of. Cole stood at the edge of the stone platform in borrowed clothing with his hair still flat from sleeping and no idea what to say. The Dracovian spoke. The voice was deep and even and carried the particular quality of someone who had spent a very long time only speaking when what they said mattered. "I am Sovereign Drain," the voice said, in human common tongue that was careful and precise and clearly learned rather than native. "I kneel because the flame writ demands it. I kneel also because I choose to. These are not always the same thing. Today they are." Cole opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "I don't," he started. "I'm not sure what's happening." "You are in the inner sanctum of the Dracovian kingdom," Drain said. "You have been here for 2 days. You were brought here by soldiers from the border unit who witnessed what happened in the neutral zone." Cole looked at his hands again, then at the room, then back at Drain. "I should be dead," he said. It was not a question. It was just the most accurate thing he could think to say. "You were," Drain said simply. "For 4 minutes and a portion of a fifth. Our healers worked through the first night. The methods they used are old. They are not used often because they are not without cost. We used them for you." Cole sat back down on the edge of the platform because his legs had decided they were done standing for the moment. He looked at the sovereign of the Dracovian kingdom kneeling on the stone floor in front of him and tried to arrange his thoughts into something useful. "The child," he said. Drain was quiet for a moment. Something moved in the ember eyes. "That is your first question," Drain said. "Not what happened to you. Not where you are. Not what we want from you." "I know what happened to me," Cole said. "I know where I am. The child was hurt. I want to know if the child is okay." Drain looked at him for a long moment. Then the sovereign rose from the kneeling position, straightening to full height, and the room felt smaller immediately. "The child is safe," Drain said. "The wing has been set and is healing. The other injuries were minor. Kale is resting and is being cared for." Cole let out a breath he had been carrying somewhere very deep since the moment the wall came down. "Good," he said. "That's good." Drain moved to the far side of the room and stood with his back partially to Cole, looking at the window and the pale light coming through it. When he spoke again his voice was quieter but somehow heavier. "Kale is the last of the direct royal bloodline," Drain said. "There are no others. What that means for the kingdom is something our council has discussed for years with no answer. What it means in this moment is that the child you pulled from the ruins and covered with your body when the wall came down was not simply a child." Cole was quiet. "I understand that you did not know this," Drain said. "I understand that it would not have changed what you did. That is precisely why I am kneeling on your floor instead of the other way around." Cole looked at the patterns on the ceiling for a moment. Wings and fire and the thing in between. "I just heard a sound," he said. "I couldn't walk past it." "No," Drain said. "You could not." He turned from the window and looked at Cole directly. "That is what my soldiers reported. That every other being in that zone heard the same sounds at various points in the previous days. That none of them investigated. That you went back in alone after being told not to." Cole did not say anything to that. "You will have questions," Drain said. "About what was done to bring you back. About what changes that may have made. About what the flame writ requires now and what it means for you." He paused. "All of those conversations will happen. But first I wanted to come here myself. Before the council. Before the law. Just to look at the being who covered my child with his body when the stone came down." The room was quiet for a long moment. Cole looked at the sovereign carefully. Then he said the only thing that honestly mattered to him in that moment. "Can I see Kale?" he asked. "Just to see for myself that he's okay. I won't stay long." Drain looked at him. The ember eyes were very still. "Yes," the sovereign said quietly. "I think that would be good for both of you." The council chamber was the oldest room in the kingdom. Cole could feel that just by walking into it. Not in any way he could explain properly. Just a sense that the stone under his feet had been there long before he was born and would be there long after everything he had ever known was gone. The walls were black and smooth and rose so high that the top of them disappeared into shadow. Torches burned in iron brackets along the sides, real flame this time, and the light they gave was orange and unsteady and made everything look like it was slowly moving. 12 Dracovians sat in a curved row on a raised platform at the far end of the room. Each one was large. Each one was old. Each one watched Cole walk in with an expression that ranged from carefully neutral to openly uncomfortable. The seats they occupied were carved directly from the stone wall behind them, as if the mountain itself had grown chairs for them over a very long period of time. Cole walked in wearing the same simple dark clothing he had woken up in. He had no armor, no title, no rank, and no idea exactly what was about to happen. He had been told only that the council needed to see him and that he should answer questions honestly. He intended to do both of those things. Sovereign Drain was not sitting with the council. He stood to the side, separate from the curved row, which Cole understood was a statement of some kind. Present but not presiding. Watching but not controlling. The ember eyes found Cole as he entered and stayed with him as he crossed the floor. At the center of the curved row sat an elder whose scales were almost white. Not gray the way Drain's were gray, but the pale faded color of something very old that had once been much darker. His eyes were sharp and clear and deeply unhappy about the situation. Cole did not need to be told that this one was going to be the problem. A younger council member, seated near the left end of the row, stood and spoke first. His voice was careful and formal and he introduced himself as the keeper of records. He explained that he was going to read from the flame writ. He explained what the flame writ was for Cole's benefit, though Cole suspected the explanation was also for the benefit of the council members who wanted everything on record. The flame writ was the oldest legal document the kingdom possessed. It predated the current royal line. It predated most of the buildings they were standing in. It had been written in a time when the kingdom faced threats that no longer existed in the same form, and its laws had been created to make sure the kingdom survived those threats no matter what they cost. The keeper of records opened a case that had been sitting on a stand beside his seat. The document inside was dark with age and sealed behind a covering that looked like glass but was probably not glass. He read from it in Dracovian first and then translated carefully into common tongue. The relevant passage was not long. Cole listened to every word of it. Any being of any origin who gives their life in the protection of a royal heir and is returned from death shall be offered a place among the Ashen Guard. This offer cannot be withheld by council vote. This offer cannot be conditional. The being may refuse. The being may not be refused. The keeper of records closed the case and sat down. The white-scaled elder stood up before anyone else could speak. His name was Ward and he did not waste time on politeness. He was not rude exactly, but he had clearly decided that directness was more important than comfort in this particular situation, and he was going to be direct regardless of how it landed. A human could not serve in the Ashen Guard. This was not an opinion. This was a physical reality. The Ashen Guard required flight capability for rapid response across the kingdom's mountain terrain. It required fire for combat situations where conventional weapons were insufficient. It required a lifespan long enough to accumulate the knowledge and experience the role demanded. Humans lived at most 100 years. Ashen Guard members served for centuries. The training alone took decades. A human would complete training and then die of old age before they had served long enough to be useful. He went on. Cole let him go on. He stood in the center of the chamber floor with his hands at his sides and his face calm, and he listened to every word Ward said without interrupting any of it. When Ward finally stopped and sat back down with the energy of someone who had made an argument so complete it required no response, Cole spoke. "Can I ask some questions?" he said. "Just to understand the situation better." Ward looked at him with an expression that suggested he found the request mildly surprising but had no grounds to refuse it. He gestured with one hand. "Go ahead." Cole looked at the council as a whole rather than at Ward specifically. "The Ashen Guard responds to threats across the mountain terrain," he said. "How often do those threats come from inside the walls rather than outside them?" There was a short silence. The keeper of records answered. "Historically," he said carefully, "internal threats had accounted for a significant portion of incidents requiring Ashen Guard response. Particularly in the last century." Cole nodded. "And when a threat comes from inside the walls," he said, "specifically from inside the inner sanctum, through corridors built for Dracovian bodies, what's the response time for a full Ashen Guard member to reach the royal chambers through those corridors?" This silence was longer. 2 council members looked at each other. A third looked at the floor. Cole waited. General Sten, who had been standing near the wall and had not sat with the council, answered quietly. He said a number. It was not a small number. "A human," Cole said, "can move through those corridors faster than a full-grown Dracovian because a human is smaller. Not better." not stronger. Just smaller. Which in a narrow corridor is sometimes the thing that matters. He paused. Then he asked the third question. The night I was brought here, he said, was there anything in Kale's medical situation that your healers were uncertain about? Anything that required a different approach than standard Dracovian healing methods? The silence this time had a different quality. It was not the silence of people who did not have an answer. It was the silence of people who did not want to give one in this setting. Aaron, the senior healer, spoke from near the back of the room. He said yes. There had been a situation with the wing joint that required a technique closer to what he had read about in human field medicine texts than anything in standard Dracovian practice. They had improvised based on those texts and it had worked. He said this carefully and quietly and looked slightly uncomfortable saying it. Cole did not say anything else. He just stood there and let the room be quiet. Ward was looking at him with an expression that had shifted. It was not warm. It was not friendly. But it was different from what it had been 5 minutes ago. It was the expression of someone reassessing something they thought they had already finished thinking about. Sovereign Drain cast his vote from his position at the side of the room. His voice was even and final, and when it landed the remaining council members added theirs in sequence. The count was not close. The Flamerate stood. Cole was to be offered initiation into the Ashen Guard. Cole stood in the center of the chamber floor and looked at the ancient stone and the old flame light and thought about what to say. He thought about the weight of it. A place in an order that had existed for centuries. A role built for beings with wings and fire and lifespans longer than entire human civilizations. He thought about the things he could not do and the things he could and whether the second list was long enough to make the first one matter less. He was still thinking when the door at the side of the chamber opened. It opened fast and low, the way doors opened when the person opening them was small and determined and had been waiting on the other side for longer than they were supposed to. Kale came through it at speed with the healing wing held carefully against his side and the gold eyes already scanning the room. Those eyes found Cole in about 1 second. Kale crossed the chamber floor and stopped directly beside Cole and looked up at him and then looked at the council with an expression that was remarkable on a face that young. It was the expression of someone who had already made a decision and was simply informing the room of what it was. One of the guards who had presumably been watching the door appeared in the opening looking deeply apologetic. Cole looked down at Kale. Kale looked up at Cole. Cole looked back at the council. "I'll do it," he said. The training grounds of the Ashen Guard were not built with failure in mind. They were built with the assumption that anyone standing on them already had wings, fire, scales, and several decades of combat experience behind them. The ground itself was uneven volcanic rock, sharp in places and unstable in others, the kind of surface that punished anyone who was not paying attention every single second. The air was hotter than the rest of the kingdom, fed by vents in the mountain that pushed warm air up through cracks in the stone. The obstacles were large, the gaps between platforms were wide, and everything about the place communicated a single clear message to anyone looking at it. This was not built for you. Cole looked at it on the first morning and took a slow breath and started working out which parts of it he could actually use. There were 12 other initiates in his group. All Dracovian. The shortest one was still a full head taller than Cole and outweighed him by more than he wanted to think about. They had looked at him when he arrived with expressions that covered a wide range of reactions. Curiosity. Confusion. A particular kind of pity that was not unkind but was not comfortable either. One of them, a younger initiate named Finn with lighter scales than the others and careful watchful eyes, had simply looked at Cole for a long moment and then looked away without any expression at all. Cole had noted that one specifically. The quiet ones were usually the ones worth paying attention to. General Sten ran the trials personally. He was not warm about it. He explained each trial once in flat, clear language and did not repeat himself. He did not make any special comment about Cole's presence. He did not adjust anything. He simply told everyone what was expected and then waited to see what happened. The first trial was combat assessment. Cole's opponent was a senior Ashen Guard member named Bran, brought in specifically for initiate evaluations. Bran was not the largest Dracovian Cole had seen, but he was built in the particular way that suggested every part of him had been used hard for a very long time and had only gotten more solid for it. He looked at Cole the way a stone wall looks at weather. Patient. Certain of the outcome. The match was not close in terms of direct force. Cole knew that going in and did not waste energy pretending otherwise. When Bran moved it was like something geological shifting. Cole got out of the way. He kept moving. He used the uneven ground that bothered everyone else because he had spent the previous evening walking it in the dark until he knew where every unstable patch was. He changed direction constantly. He made Bran turn and turn and turn again because turning cost energy and Bran was large and large things spent more energy changing direction than small things did. He did not win. He was never going to win. But he stayed on his feet for significantly longer than anyone in the watching group seemed to have expected, and when he finally went down it was because he ran out of floor to use rather than because he made an obvious mistake. Bran stood over him afterward and looked down with an expression that had shifted slightly from the stone wall certainty of before. Sten said nothing. He wrote something down. The second trial was the Fire Wasteland. The wasteland was a section of terrain beyond the training grounds where the ground vents were fully open and the air temperature was high enough to make breathing uncomfortable for anything that was not built for it. The trial was endurance. You went in. You stayed in. You came out when you could not stay anymore. The time was recorded. The expectation for initiates was somewhere between 4 and 6 hours depending on physical conditioning. Cole stayed for the full duration. He did it by moving slowly and drinking water in very small amounts at regular intervals and by keeping his body temperature down through controlled breathing and by finding the spots where the ground vents were less active and resting in those spots during the hottest parts of the cycle. He explained this to nobody while he was doing it. He just did it. Afterward, when Finn asked him quietly how he had managed it, Cole told him about persistence hunting. About how humans in the oldest parts of their history had hunted animals not by being faster or stronger but by following them through heat for so long that the animal eventually had nowhere left to go. About how the human body was specifically built to keep moving through discomfort in a way that very few other bodies were. Finn listened to all of this without saying anything. Then he went away and Cole was fairly certain he was going to think about it for a long time. Sten wrote something down again. The third trial was the medical simulation. A training scenario. An initiate had been injured, played by a volunteer, and the candidate had to stabilize the patient using only what was available in the environment. The available supplies were minimal. The injury was complicated. The assumption built into the trial was that the candidate would use standard Dracovian healing methods which required specific knowledge of Dracovian biology and specific tools to apply correctly. Cole did not have those tools. He did not have that specific knowledge. What he had was 15 years of field medicine experience working in disaster zones with whatever happened to be nearby. He worked fast and quiet. He used strips from his own clothing for binding. He used a piece of flat stone as a brace. He applied pressure in a way that was not standard Dracovian practice but was textbook human trauma response and happened to work on Dracovian physiology better than the trial designers had anticipated because the underlying mechanics of keeping blood inside a body were not as different across species as most people assumed. The Dracovian healers who were observing the trial to grade it went very quiet about halfway through. They stayed quiet. When Cole finished and stood up and looked at them, they were looking at his work with expressions he could not fully read but that contained something that might have been reassessment. Sten did not write something down this time. He just looked at Cole for a moment and then looked at his record sheet and then looked back at Cole. That evening Cole sat outside the barracks on a flat piece of stone and looked at the mountain sky and let his body rest. His hands hurt. His legs hurt. Everything had a low steady ache that he had learned a long time ago to simply set to one side and not argue with. He was aware of Finn sitting down nearby and not saying anything for a while, which Cole had started to understand was Finn's version of conversation. Cale had appeared at the training grounds twice during the week. Both times he had gotten past the outer checkpoint somehow and both times Cole had found him before anyone else and walked him back to the inner sanctum without mentioning it to Sten or the guards. He did not do this because he thought the rules were wrong. He did it because Cale was small and determined and scared in a way he hid very well, and Cole understood all three of those things from personal experience. The second time he returned Cale, he had sat with the child for a few minutes in the corridor outside the royal chambers. Cale had not said much. He had just sat close to Cole the way small things sat close to whatever they had decided was safe. Cole had not said much either. They had just sat there in the corridor while the mountain made its low quiet sounds around them. It was on the final night of trials that the alarm sounded. Cole was not asleep. He had been lying on his bunk running through the next day's evaluation in his head when the sound cut through the mountain quiet like something sharp. It was not loud. It was a specific tone, low and pulsing, that he had been told during orientation meant a security breach in the inner sanctum. He was on his feet before it finished its first cycle. The barracks door opened and Sten's voice came through it, flat and immediate. Lockdown. All initiates stay in position. Ashenguard units were already deploying. Cole stood in the middle of the barracks floor. He thought about the narrow maintenance corridors he had found during his second week, the ones built into the walls for heating system access, the ones that ran parallel to the main halls but were half the width, the ones he had explored quietly because understanding the layout of a space was a habit he could not turn off. He thought about where those corridors led. He thought about Kale. He looked at the door for one more second. Then he went through it. The maintenance corridors were not meant for anyone to spend time in. They were narrow and low, and the stone walls on both sides were rough and unfinished, nothing like the smooth carved passages of the main sanctum halls. They had been built purely for function, for the workers who maintained the heating vents and the water channels that ran through the mountain. No torches. No amber light strips. Just darkness and the smell of old stone and the low steady warmth coming up through the floor vents beneath Cole's feet. Cole moved through them fast and quiet with one hand on the wall to his left for guidance. He had found these corridors during his second week of initiation, not because anyone showed them to him but because he could not stop himself from learning the layout of any space he was going to spend significant time in. It was an old habit from field work. You always knew your exits. You always knew the ways in and out that other people had not thought about yet. He had walked these corridors twice in the evenings when the training schedule gave him an hour of unstructured time, moving slowly with a small light source, memorizing turns and distances and where each branch led. He knew where he was going now. The main hall approach to Kale's chamber required passing through 3 checkpoints, each staffed by Ashen Guard members, each designed to stop a threat moving at speed through open corridor. Anyone who knew the sanctum layout would know that a direct approach was close to impossible. The maintenance corridor that ran parallel to the east wing of the royal chambers came out through a service access point 12 feet from Kale's chamber door. It was half the width of the main corridors. A full-grown Dracovian could not fit through it without damage to themselves and significant noise. Cole fit through it with room to spare. He was moving fast but thinking faster. The breach alarm had been specific in its tone. Inner sanctum. Not the outer walls. Not the training grounds. Whoever had come in had already passed the outer defenses, which meant they knew the layout, which meant this was planned, which meant they had a specific target and a specific route already worked out. Cole thought about the target and about the route and about what a planned operative would do when the alarm sounded and the main corridors started filling with Ashen Guard response units. They would go to a secondary route. Cole took a left turn in the dark and moved faster. He came out of the corridor through the service access point 30 seconds later and was in the small antechamber that sat between the east wing passage and Kale's chamber door. The antechamber was empty. The door to Kale's chamber was closed. The guard post beside the door was also empty, which meant the guard had already moved to respond to the alarm through the main hall. Cole pressed himself against the wall beside the service access point and listened. Footsteps. Coming from the east wing passage. Not the heavy deliberate sound of Dracovian boots on stone. Lighter. Faster. A rhythm that was trying to be quiet and mostly succeeding. Cole looked at the antechamber. He looked at the door. He looked at the narrow opening of the east wing passage where it met the antechamber and thought about angles and distances and what he had and what he did not have. What he had was his position and the element of surprise and the fact that he was significantly smaller than whoever was coming, which in this specific space was going to matter. What he did not have was a weapon, body armor, or any realistic chance of physically overpowering a trained operative in direct combat. He did the math quickly and picked his spot. The operative came through the east wing passage into the antechamber moving fast and low and stopped for exactly half a second when they registered that the antechamber was not empty. Cole was already moving. He did not try to fight them. He drove his shoulder into the operative's forward momentum and used their own speed against them, pushing them sideways and off balance and away from the chamber door. They were bigger than him and they recovered fast, faster than he wanted, and the first rail hit landed across his left side and took his breath completely away for a moment that felt much longer than it was. He held on. That was the sum total of his strategy at that point. He held on and made himself as difficult to remove from the situation as possible. Every second the operative spent dealing with Cole was a second they were not at Kale's door. Every second was time for Sten and the response units to move through the main corridors and reach this part of the sanctum. The second hit was harder. Something in his left arm registered damage in a way that moved from sharp to hot to a deep persistent wrong that he noted and set aside because there was nothing useful he could do about it right now. He got his legs around the operative's lower body and made himself a problem that required both hands to deal with. The operative used both hands. Cole took the hits that came with that arrangement and kept his grip and kept his position between the operative and the chamber door and kept his eyes on the door because that was the only thing that mattered in this specific moment. He was not going to win this. He had known that from the beginning. He just needed to not lose it for long enough. The sound of boots in the main corridor came first. Then voices. Then General Sten came through the east wing passage with 2 senior Ashen Guard members behind him, and the antechamber went from a contained problem to a finished one in a very short period of time. Cole let go. He ended up on the floor with his back against the wall beside the service access point, which was exactly where he had started except that his left arm was sending him consistent unhappy signals and his ribs on the left side were making breathing an activity that required conscious effort. He sat on the floor and looked at the chamber door. The door was closed. It had not opened. Whatever was on the other side of it was still on the other side of it, and whatever was on the other side of it was Kale. Sten dealt with the operative quickly and efficiently and with the particular energy of someone who had been moving fast through corridors for several minutes and had arrived wanting very much to be useful. When it was done he turned and looked at the antechamber and found Cole on the floor. Sten crossed to him and crouched down, which for a Dracovian of his size was a significant gesture of practicality, and looked at Cole's left arm and then at his side and then at his face. Cole was still looking at the chamber door. "The child is behind that door," Cole said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. "Can someone check?" Sten looked at him for a moment. Then he straightened up and said something to one of the senior guardians who crossed to the chamber door and opened it and looked inside and reported back in Dracovian that Cole could not follow at speed but that Sten's posture changed when he heard it in a way that meant the news was good. "Kale is safe," Sten said. Cole nodded. Then he let his head rest back against the stone wall and closed his eyes for a moment. Kale came through the chamber door about 4 seconds later at the particular speed of a small determined creature who had heard voices and made a decision about what to do about that. The gold eyes found Cole on the floor and Kale crossed to him and sat down directly beside him with the healed wing folded carefully and the small body pressed close to Cole's right side, the side that did not hurt. Cole put his right arm around the child without thinking about it. The healers came. The arm was set. The ribs were assessed and wrapped and declared unhappy but not dangerous. Cole sat through all of it on the floor of the antechamber because nobody had suggested he move yet and the floor seemed fine. Sten stood near the passage entrance and watched all of it without speaking. The next morning the full Ashen Guard initiates and senior members were assembled in the main training ground for the daily evaluation briefing. It was routine. Sten ran it the same way every morning, flat and direct and without ceremony. That morning he added one item at the end. He said that he was withdrawing his formal objection to the human initiate's candidacy for the Ashen Guard. He said this in the same tone he used to announce schedule changes and equipment requirements. He did not explain his reasons. He did not look at Cole while he said it. He simply stated it as a fact, the way Sten stated everything, as though it had always been true and he was merely informing the room. Then he moved on to the day's schedule. Cole stood in the assembly line between Finn and another initiate and looked straight ahead and said nothing. Finn glanced sideways at him once. Cole did not look back but he was fairly certain that if he had, Finn would have been almost smiling. The flame hall had been standing for longer than anyone in the kingdom could accurately measure. That was what Finn told Cole the night before the ceremony, sitting on the stone steps outside the barracks with the mountain wind moving quietly around them. Finn had become something in the weeks since the night of the operative. Not a loud friendship. Not the kind that announced itself. Just a steady presence that showed up without being asked and said useful things when it had useful things to say and stayed quiet when it did not. Cole valued that kind of company more than the other kind. Finn said the Flame Hall was older than the Flame Writ. Older than the current royal line. Older than most of the stories the kingdom told about itself. The stone it was built from came from the deepest part of the mountain, the part that nobody went into anymore, and it had been shaped by methods that the current generation of builders did not fully understand. Every Ashen Guard member who had ever been inducted had stood in that room. Every vow that had ever been spoken in the Order's history had been spoken in that room. Cole listened to all of this and then sat quietly for a while looking at the mountain sky. He had been preparing for 3 weeks. Not the physical preparation that was ongoing and would continue regardless. The other kind. The kind that happened in the hours before sleep when he sat with the Dracovian language text that Aaron had quietly left outside his barracks door one morning without explanation or comment. The ancient form of the language, not the common tongue that educated Dracovians used when speaking to outsiders, but the old form, the one the Flame Writ was written in, the one the Guardian vow had been spoken in since the beginning of the Order. He had not told anyone he was doing this. He had simply done it because it seemed like the right thing to do. The vow belonged to the Order in its original form. Speaking it in translation felt like handing something back with a piece missing. Cole did not want to hand anything back with a piece missing. Finn looked at him on the steps that night and said nothing. Cole got the impression Finn knew something was planned and had decided not to ask about it, which was exactly the right decision. The morning of the ceremony was cold and clear. The kind of morning that felt deliberate, like the mountain had arranged the weather specifically for the occasion. Cole dressed in the formal clothing that had been left for him, dark like the standard dress but with small details at the collar and cuff that he had not seen before, subtle markings that he recognized after a moment as the border pattern of the Ashen Guard insignia. Someone had thought carefully about how to make the clothing appropriate without making it pretend he was something he was not. He walked to the Flame Hall alone. The hall was full when he arrived. The full Ashen Guard, senior members and initiates both, stood in rows along the walls. They were still and quiet in the way large things were quiet when they were being deliberately respectful. The torches along the walls burned steadily in the cold mountain air coming through the high vents, and the light they gave was warm and even and very old-looking. Sovereign Drain stood at the far end of the hall on the raised stone where the ceremony was conducted. He was in formal robes that Cole had not seen before, darker than his usual dress and longer, with the same border pattern repeated in detail that must have taken someone a very long time to complete. Cale was seated to the right of the raised stone in a chair that was slightly too large for him, which meant his feet did not quite reach the floor, which meant he was sitting with his legs hanging and his gold eyes moving around the room with an alertness that suggested he had been awake for some time and was not planning to miss any part of what was about to happen. Cole walked to the center of the hall and stood on the mark in the floor that indicated where the inductee stood. He looked at Drain. Drain looked at him with the ember eyes that never seemed to change temperature regardless of what was happening around them. General Sten stepped forward from the senior guard line. He was carrying the marking tool, a handled instrument of old dark metal that Cole had been told about but not shown in detail. Sten crossed to Cole and stood before him and looked at him in the flat direct way that Sten looked at everything. "The vow first," Sten said. "Then the mark." Cole nodded. He took a breath. Then he began. The ancient Dracovian came out carefully and then more steadily as the first few words settled and the memorized patterns found their rhythm. It was not a short vow. It covered the duty of the guardian to the kingdom, to the royal line, to the order itself, and finally to the beings under the order's protection regardless of their origin or standing. Cole had read the translation so many times that he heard both versions simultaneously as he spoke, the old words carrying the meaning underneath them like water under ice. The hall was completely silent. He could not see faces clearly from the center of the floor, but he was aware of the quality of the silence changing partway through. It had started as the polite silence of an audience at a ceremony. It became something else. The kind of silence that happened when a room full of people was paying a different kind of attention than they had planned to. He finished the vow and the last word settled into the hall and stayed there for a moment before the silence absorbed it. Sten looked at him. Something in the old general's face was very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Then Sten applied the guardian mark. It was placed on the inside of the left forearm, the same position it occupied on every Ashen Guard member. The sensation was significant. Cole had been told it would be and had believed the telling and was still slightly surprised by the reality of it. He kept his arm steady and his face quiet and his eyes forward, and when it was done he looked at the mark on his arm for a moment before lowering his sleeve. Drain stepped forward to the edge of the raised stone and looked out at the assembled order. He spoke in Dracovian first and then in common tongue, which Cole understood was for his benefit and appreciated without showing it. Drain's voice carried through the hall without effort, the way voices carried when a room had been built specifically to hold them. He spoke about what the Ashen Guard was for. Not the history, not the law, not the flame writ. The purpose underneath all of those things. He said that the order had been built on a single idea. That when everything was breaking, when the walls were coming down and the situation was beyond what strength or fire or speed could solve, there had to be someone who did not break. Not someone who could not be hurt. Not someone who felt nothing. Someone who felt everything and held anyway. Someone who stayed when staying was the hardest available option. He did not say Cole's name. He did not look at Cole while he spoke. He did not need to do either of those things. Every person in the room knew exactly what the words were connected to and where they had come from. Cole stood at the center of the floor with the guardian mark on his arm and listened and let the words be what they were. Afterward the formal assembly dispersed and the hall emptied gradually with the particular slow movement of a large group that was not in a hurry. Cole stood near the wall and accepted the acknowledgments that came to him from passing guard members, some brief, some more considered, all of them genuine in a way that he had not known how to expect but recognized when it arrived. Cale found him when most of the hall had cleared. The child crossed the floor with the direct purposeful movement that Cole had come to understand was simply how Cale moved when he knew where he was going. He stopped in front of Cole and looked up at him with the gold eyes and was quiet for a moment in the way that meant a question was coming. "Why did you save me?" Cale said. "Before all of this. Before the kingdom and the law and everything. When you did not know who I was." Cole looked at the child. He thought about the ruins and the sound in the dark and the wall coming down and the gold eyes in the hollow under the beam. He thought about how long it had actually taken him to make the decision to go in and realized the answer was that it had not taken any time at all. "Because you were scared," he said. "And I was there." Cale was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if Cole was going to stay. Cole looked at the flame hall around him. The old stone and the steady torches and the mountain solid beneath his feet. He thought about the borrowed clothing he had woken up in and how it did not feel borrowed anymore. He thought about Finn on the steps and Sten's voice in the morning briefing and Drain kneeling on the floor of a room built for something much larger than a human relief worker from a neutral zone. He looked back at Cale. "I think I'm already home," he said. Cale sat down beside him on the stone floor of the flame hall the way he always sat, close and settled and certain, and Cole sat beside him and the mountain was quiet around them and the torches burned the way they had always burned in that room, steady and old and without any intention of going out. Months later, when the formal request came from human authorities asking for Cole's return, the kingdom's response was brief. It stated that Cole held a rank and a mark under the flame writ and that the flame writ protected in both directions. He had given. The kingdom gave back. He was theirs and they were his, and that was the end of the matter. The last thing was not in any document. It was early morning on the high wall of the fortress, the light just beginning and the air still cold, Cole standing watch with Cale beside him wrapped in a dark blanket that was slightly too large, learning to read from a worn paperback book that Cole had carried in his coat pocket since before any of this began. The mountain spread out below them in the growing light. The kingdom was waking up slowly around them, the sounds of it rising through the stone in a low familiar way. Cole watched the horizon. He was exactly where he was supposed to be.